Welcome everyone to the Faculty of Humanities and Education distinguished lecture. We are certainly honored to have as our speaker this evening Dr. John B. Zimori. I hope I said that correctly and in the correct order. A leading expert in Latin American literature. I've seen it elsewhere online. Hispanic literature, am I correct? He's here with us today to provide some insights on this. I think I like the word anxiety in this topic, given the level of uncertainties in the world now. So it's Latin American literature as play in a time of anxiety. And we want to give him a warm welcome and to welcome all our visitors online. All 31 of you online, welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And I want to introduce you this evening to our Dean, Professor Coinberg, Sylvia Coinberg, who will bring in remarks for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm happy that we have reached the 10th occasion in our annual Distinguished Lecture Series, and I would add that even during the COVID pandemic, the series was continued. And the series was conceived by my predecessor, Dean Professor Rarigo, as a way to draw attention to what we do in this faculty, both in terms of our research and our practice and our programs. And so I just want to, since it's just 10, I just want to go through our previous lectures for a bit. The first lecture was in the cultural and creative industries, and it actually, we were on the cusp of introducing a program in the cultural and creative industries. The second lecture was on digital literacies, which of course has been a topic of interest, of continuing interest over the years. The third lecture was on digital humanities. The fourth lecture was on STEM education, which is, a huge push in the current environment. Of course, we actually wanted that to be STEAM, but I think that the thinking at the time wasn't so much on STEAM. We have had a lecture on, I think it was called, the first rough draft of history, Journalism's Empty Promise, a very intriguing title, and it heralded the program in history and journalism that was developed. The next lecture was by Ken Wilby on Jamaican music at home and abroad. This was during the pandemic, online. And it was the beginnings, heralded the introduction of our music and performance studies program. Then a lecture on teaching from the digital Black Atlantic by Professor Rupika Rissan, a public scholar, digital humanist, and so on, again pushing our digital scholarship forward. And next is number 8, I'm almost there. Number 8, Beyond Scholarship in Humanities and Social Sciences, Lessons from Linguistics. And this made the connection between research in different areas across the humanities. And then the 9th lecture last year by Dr. Eaton was a lecture in academic integrity, which has been, a topic of huge interest and concern in an environment in which artificial intelligence is disrupting our standardized processes by which we ensure academic integrity or hope to do so. So now number 10, what is this, particular topic going to portend? Well, of course, we just discussed this, we're going to be discussing in the very near future a proposal at faculty board for a program in Latin American studies, am I right?
Yes.
And so this is, in a sense, a little push for the interest in that topic. And again, a most intriguing title. I love the reference to play, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say to us. Welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Who says one?
Yes. She's going to introduce.
Where is she? The one is right there.
Oh, this one. Okay. You were going to introduce me. Okay, well, following the words of Sylvia, Professor Coenberg, really, I've been interested for a while in creating a program, developing a program in Latin American Studies. Our department together with history, so I hope that this is going to be, as she said, a push for it. And I'm going to introduce this evening our distinguished lecturers. If you ever wonder what would happen if critical theory.
Sorry, we have a little feedback here, John.
I'm sorry, continue?
Continue, yes.
Yes. Okay. So if you ever wondered what would happen if critical theory, Latin American literature, and a healthy dose of online wit collided, meet Professor John Wesley Moore. A scholar, a blogger, a digital innovator, John is perhaps best known for once daring to use Wikipedia as a teaching tool and living to tell the tale. So he's not only intellectually sharp, but also manages to make Gramsci and Garcia Marquez feel like part of the same conversation and somehow relevant to your Twitter feed. So John holds a BA in English Literature from King's College, Cambridge, and an MA from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and a PhD from Duke University. He's currently Associate Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of British Columbia, UBC, in Vancouver, Canada. Before joining the UBC, he taught at the universities of Aberdeen and Manchester, where he co-founded the Center for Latin American Cultural Studies. And I hope you help me with that in the future. And also, where I met him, I don't know if you remember, in June 2002, at a conference in Manchester. I'm giving away our age. In a conference at Manchester with Nestor Garcia Cantini, which was an unforgettable event because after that I didn't meet him again. But yes, and we both were then PhD students. I was starting, you were finishing. We were finishing. So at UBC, John teaches an exciting mix of courses ranging from Spanish language and advanced translation to deep dives into Latin American literature, film, and political thought. His course titles alone are enough to spark curiosity. Latin American dictator novel by Latin American literature, prize-winning novels, Latino literature and culture, Mexican film, human and civil rights in Latin America, etc. And students flock to his classes not only for the engaging content, but for the way he makes complex thinkers like Deleuze, Bourdieu, or Negri feel entirely conversational and occasionally memorable. So his research centers on Latin American cultural, literary, and political history, with particular focus on social developments, colonial legacies, globalization, and post-hegemonic theory. Drawing from Marxist thought, continental philosophy, post-structuralism, and critical theory, John's work proposes bold and innovative frameworks for understanding power, ideology, and resistance in Latin America. The scholarship is positioned within contemporary debates on culture, ideology, and global dynamics. Through both his teaching and research, he has significantly contributed to shaping a transdisciplinary understanding of Latin America, one that transcends traditional literary analysis and actively engaged with broader sociopolitical structures and transformation. He's best known for his influential book, Post-Hegemony, Political Theory and Latin America, published by University of Minnesota Press, 2010. This groundbreaking work critiques traditional concepts of hegemony, ideology. This work has become a touchstone in both cultural and political studies, repositioning Latin American cultural theory at the center of global academic debate. John has also published widely in international journals, such as Journal of Latin American Research, Latin American Research, etc., among others. But in short, and finish the presentation, Professor John Beasley Murray is a key voice in contemporary Latin American cultural studies, a sharp mind, a general teacher for what they heard, and someone who reminds us that theory can be both rigorous and fun. So, without further ado, aquí tenemos a Professor John Beasley Murray.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes. Yes.
There seems to be a little bit of... perhaps we could mute the room. There's a little bit of feedback or something from the room. Is that... Oh, that seems to have been done. Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure and a delight and an honor to be speaking to you. Greetings from Vancouver. I very much wish that I was there with you, although the weather's not too bad in Vancouver at the moment. But obviously, Zoom is never quite the same as a personal face-to-face connection. Thank you especially to Maite for her invitation, as well as her introduction just now, and for everything she's done to make this possible. I'm going to turn... Oh, gosh. Fortunately, in some ways, I've forgotten a little bit how Zoom works, but let me see if I can share my screen. And now, can you see that okay? Maybe a thumbs up or something. Is that... can you see my screen? You should be able to see a slide that says Latin American Literature's Play in a Time of Anxiety, and it's red. Okay, I see at least 2 thumbs up, so I take it that is working for at least some people. This is going to be I hope this to be fairly informal, and feel free to interrupt or to write in the chat or something. I'll try and monitor the chat. I'm also hoping that it is something that appeals to more than one discipline. That's part of the idea. So, although I have Latin American literature in the title, Maite also nudged me to say at least something about other literatures too that are represented in your department. So I've expanded a little so I'll be talking a little bit about Romance studies, which is essentially what here at least we talk about when we try to think beyond any individual language in our department. My department is called French, Hispanic, Italian Studies. So I'll be speaking a little bit about Romance studies as well. And then, let's see. Okay, here we go. And so what I'll be talking about relates to 2 books that I am or have been working on, both of which come out of teaching. So one which is finished and is forthcoming at some point is on Romance studies, Manifesto and Method. Another one which is almost finished. I've just got a little bit more to do, and then hopefully it will also shortly see the world, is called Hopscotch, Program and Play, which is on Latin American literature specifically. But both of these books come out of and relate to 2 courses that I've taught over the last few years, Introduction to Literatures and Cultures of the Romance World, and a course called Hopscotch, Latin American Literature and Translation. And so I've put those links there, but I've also put them in the chat, which you may want to have a look at. They're links, the first 2 links to the drafts of the book, of the books rather, and the second to the websites of the courses involved. And here, this is more or less the set of themes, or this is I guess, the program. This is the path I hope to take us along, although it depends on how time goes. I may skip a little. So first of all, to talk about the decline of the humanities and a time of anxiety and how those things seem to me linked to me. And then to talk about anxiety in the classroom, one or a couple of possible responses to that, one of which is rethinking the grade, and then looking at excess and betrayal, playing with the canon, and finally, rather than a conclusion, some thoughts for sort of an in conclusion, some thoughts for how one might continue on. So that's more or less as I say, the program here, or what I hope to get through. So first of all, the decline of the humanities. I mean, this is not exactly a new theme, but we've seen the university see its status fall. I mean, as I was sort of preparing this talk the last few weeks, putting things together, which I've been thinking about for a long time, of course, everything that's going on in the USA has been sort of up in my mind, and the ways in which we see the rising populism in the USA in the form of Trump, but Trump was certainly not the first. Thatcher in Britain certainly attacked institutions. In Britain also, Brexit, for instance, was a point at which we saw a distrust in intellectuals, right? A distrust in experts. And we've even got to the point where in the last few weeks, it seems as though, of all places, Harvard, which has a endowment more than 100 countries, 53 billion, I think, suddenly becomes the new pole of resistance, a very sort of odd state of affairs. So there's been an attack on the status of intellectuals, an attack on the university status fall, but perhaps the humanities have borne the brunt of that attack. But perhaps they're also some sort of canary in the coal mine, or even perhaps more optimistically, the fate of the humanities may be in advance of the fate of the rest of the university. And if there is a better future for the university, perhaps we can see it here in the humanities. So just a few quotations to bear out what I'm saying. This is about Canada. The fact that humanities enrollment overall has dropped by about 70,000 students every year between the early 1990s and the 2022-2023 school year. That comes from the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Service. This is an article a little older, but which was much discussed at the time. About almost every humanities field has seen a rapid drop in majors. History's down about 45% from its 2007 peak. The number of English majors has fallen by nearly half since the late 1990s. And of course, for smaller departments like languages, I mean, a history department or an English department may be able, at least for the time being, to bear that kind of decline, but it's much more difficult for a department which is already small, such as tends to be the case of languages and literature departments. Declines have hit almost every field in the humanities and related social sciences and have not stabilized with the economic recovery. At some point, there was a thought that this decline was related to the 2008 economic crisis, but even a few years later, there wasn't much of a recovery. This is taken from that article. It's just a couple of graphs. This is about the change in share of humanities majors in all BAs. This is the US, but again, the situation, as far as I understand it, is pretty similar in many other countries. We see languages and literature here, and then at the bottom, history and English. Similar here about the percentage of English, history, philosophy, and languages in terms of all degrees from US universities. We see, well, there had been a long time a gender gap with significantly more women, but now both women and men, the percentage is down below 5%. And then this is an article which this is from a couple of years ago. This was also, at least in my circles, much discussed when it came out, the end of the English major. During the past decade, the study of English and history at the collegiate level has fallen by a full third. Humanities enrollment in the United States has declined overall by 17%. The trend mirrors a global one. 4/5 of countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation reported falling humanities enrollments in the past decade. So I'm going to talk about anxiety in a little while. And there's many forms of anxiety and many reasons to be anxious, and many populations who may be anxious, but one population is academics in the humanities. Graduate students that I know, and I teach in a job market which seems to not offer much in the way of hope. Massive number of applications for individual posts, for instance. In many places, the humanities face an existential threat. Jobs are cut, entire programs and departments closed. I might have mentioned that I taught in Aberdeen. My first job was in Aberdeen, and a year or so ago, I saw the news that basically the department in which I got my first job was being effectively shut down. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the majors were all being cut. Much ink, of course, has been spilled as to why, about what can be done about this situation. I don't pretend to cover all of that at all. I would like to get to be a little bit more specific in a moment. But just to point out, without the humanities, the university is also at an end. For one thing, because it's no longer universal. And maybe more importantly, perhaps, it's no longer a site of critique. It seems to me that that's what the humanities have to offer. I suppose it's a rather old-fashioned way of thinking about the university. A sort of Kantian idea of critique has always seemed to me central to what we're doing, and that's very often the province of the humanities in particular. So let me talk a little about anxiety, a more general anxiety, or other forms of anxiety, not just the anxiety of academics or people who would like to be academics, postgraduate students, for instance, but to talk particularly about anxiety amongst our students, in other words, our undergraduate students, and those who may soon become our undergraduate students. Jonathan Haidt, the New York-based sociologist, recently wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, in which he tried to chart and explain what he saw as a tidal wave, an epidemic of anxiety. And he says anxiety and its associated disorders seem to be the defining mental illnesses of young people today. A 2022 study of more than 37,000 high school students in Wisconsin found an increase of 44% in 2018, with larger increases amongst girls and LGBTQ teens. But there's a point at which he points out at which the population group, the segment of the population that used to be the least anxious, young girls in particular, young women, has become amongst the most anxious, and that's happened in more or less a generation. A 2023 study of American college students found that 37% reported feeling anxious always or most of the time, while an additional 31% felt this way about half the time. This means that only 1/3 of college students said that they feel anxiety less than half the time or never. And so here he's talking about the US. He provides statistics that suggest that much the same is true in many other parts of the world, certainly many other parts of the Anglophone world. He has statistics from the UK and Australia, across. And here's a graph taken from that book, which suggests anxiety prevalence by age. And again, this is in line with his argument. We see how the younger you are, essentially these days, the more likely you are to be anxious or to report anxiousness or to show signs of anxiety, and that this has dramatically increased over the last 10, 15 years or so. Haidt's main argument is that social media and cell phones breed anxiety. At least he talks about other factors as well, but in part his book is dedicated to trying to persuade people to get their children offline and off social media. he argues that young people are faced with ideal images of the self, for instance, and have increasingly lost the capacity for in-person socialization, lost in the virtual. The young struggle in the real. But it seems to me, and again, he talked about anxiety as a mental illness, and no doubt it is in many ways, insofar as it causes suffering. But in some ways, it's rational. Surely the real itself should make us anxious. It's not simply about a gap between virtual and the real, but there are many reasons, as we look around us, to feel anxious as a rational response to things like COVID, things like climate change, let alone the international order, for instance, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza. And then again, in the last few weeks, I was thinking even more about the way in which someone like Trump, but not just Trump, thrives on turbulence and uncertainty. Anxiety, is worth thinking a little, just briefly, about what makes anxiety different from fear, for instance. Anxiety, it seems to me, is a fear without an object. In other words, anxiety is about uncertainty, yet to attach itself to a particular cause. So, there are plenty of causes, COVID, I suggest climate change, and so on and so forth. But the notion is something else might arise. Having to be prepared for anything is part of what causes and is behind anxiety. So it's an affect, I'd say, rather than an emotion. Therefore, in that sense. So I'm interested in how this translates into the classroom with our students, classroom anxiety, and again, the causes for such anxiety, or some of the causes at least, seem very real, and they don't seem irrational at all. So the economic fears, for instance, the ways in which students fear being left behind, now that a degree is apparently a sine qua non, not simply for social mobility, for moving up. I mean, that was for much of the 20th century, at least, right? The idea was the degree was part of a ladder for social mobility to move into the middle class, for instance. But now it's without a degree, you threaten to drown. It's required simply to stand still. So this sense that young people have, and it doesn't seem completely irrational, but for just staying where they are, for maintaining their position, they have this sense that otherwise they're doomed to decline. And especially, I mean, Vancouver, this is very true. I don't know about elsewhere. The ways in which the housing market, the real estate market in Vancouver, means that people who emerge from university or entering university around university age, they can barely imagine ever being able to have security of tenure of a house, either buying or even renting. Rents are so high in some economic markets. So this sort of fear that without being able to distinguish themselves in some ways, and university and education being one of the ways in which they can distinguish themselves if they don't have other economic, for instance, or social advantages, is what's required just to be able to live in some places. Within this context, STEM majors appear less risky than humanities majors, and often perhaps parents and peer pressure encourage this view. But so I think to universities. Universities have increasingly tried to persuade people that the rationale for a university education is self-improvement, is that there's a sort of trade-off that you'll become better equipped to face the world, whether economically or socially. The university is an investment in yourself, I suppose, rather than an investment in the community, a social investment, or rather than, Mighty already suggested that she'd revealed ages, but certainly in the parts of the 20th century, at least, and in some places, for some people, university might be a place to put life on hold, right? To put such concerns on hold for a few years. Whereas now, those economic and social concerns are fully integrated within the university experience. And again, universities don't dispel that notion. Part of their attempt to appear relevant at a time when they are otherwise, as I suggested, under attack. But I sometimes think that is an argument that is counterproductive, and I'm going to suggest more about that in a little way. And then, of course, there's the question of debt in many places. Again, this is from a book by Anna Kamens, which is mostly about the US, but it is increasingly true elsewhere too. I spent the last few weeks in Peru, and everything I'm saying is certainly true of Peru as much as it is for the US. This sense of university as a requirement for maintaining status in the middle class, and as increasingly financial investment. College tuition, Kamens says, the past 15 years, federal aid has lagged behind. An unprecedented explosion of borrowing has made up the difference between what colleges charge and what federal families can afford. Between 1995 and 2005, the annual volume of federal student loans tripled to $85 billion in new loans in 2005. Two-thirds of four-year students are graduating with loan debt, an average up to $23,000 in 2004, growing every year. 3 out of 4 college students have credit cards carrying an average unpaid balance of $2,000 in 2005. So this is a little old. All of these numbers, no doubt, are inflated since then, have gone up since then. Nearly a quarter of all students are actually putting their tuition directly on plastic. So even as a degree seems to become a sine qua non, seems to become mandatory, it's also become increasingly expensive. Students emerge encumbered with debt. And increasingly, of course, have to work their way through, often taking on full-time jobs. And so, again, in my experience here, at least at UBC in Vancouver, they choose courses as much for timetable and time. You spend all this effort trying to attract students by having, Maite was talking about some of the courses that I teach, interesting, sexy titles even, and you ask students why they've taken your course, and it's, well, because it's on Monday at 10 o'clock, and I'm not working at Monday at 10 o'clock. As they have no time to waste when time is money. So again, there seem good reasons for anxiety in economic terms. Within the classroom in particular, over the last few years, something that I've noticed are also political fears. I should say, almost all of these slides, I've got much more thoughts, and I'd be very, very happy to talk about this when we get to the question and answer. But I think there's increasingly students fear saying the wrong thing. They feel at least that political debate is discouraged, and differences between them are redlined, but in which they're sort of come to seem almost essential. And that in part this is perhaps an unintended consequence of the success, at least within the university, of identity politics, in that students often feel that their identity is at stake, whatever that identity may be. That it is that it's partly because I think we encourage self-expression and learning from experience, and there are good reasons for that. But then if a student is criticized, then it is their self that is felt to be criticized. Or their experience is felt to be criticized. And again, that seems to be an unintended consequence of a movement or a tendency with which I'm generally in sympathy, right? To think about, to get beyond the notion of the liberal subject as without particularities, without a given identity, as without history. But students have read that or felt that as the notion that they are the kinds of risks that they might be taking from speaking is a risk to the self rather than a risk to be risking ideas. When the self is invested, that's also what is up for scrutiny. And so students feel, at least, that university is no longer a place for experimentation. And again, it seems to me that this is not a completely irrational anxiety. This is not a completely irrational fear. When often students feel that they're being policed not only by professors, in fact, but by other students. In general, there seems to be no margin for error. The future seems to be at stake. And any errors they make now, there's this sense of urgency as well, will be compounded as time passes. Again, against that notion, which was a problem in the universe. You know, to go back even further, the Brideshead Revisited, for instance, right? The Evelyn Waugh book, which then became in the Britain a TV series, in which, you know, university was this place in which you could sort of swan around carrying a teddy bear and not really be concerned about life. And that was only available to a very small percentage of people. There was a problem with that model. But now, by contrast, there's a sense in which the university is no longer separate from wider society at all, and all the pressures, or those felt pressures of the future and of employment and so on and so forth, are felt very immediately by students. They feel judged, as I said, not only by professors and peers. And within this context, I was interested to hear that your speaker last year, was talking about academic integrity and AI. And I wish I had smart things and interesting things to say about academic integrity and AI, except obviously this is felt by me now, and my colleagues, and maybe you, as an increasingly difficult set of technologies which now seem to be arrayed in the university and used by students. But it makes complete sense that students should turn to AI. It makes complete sense that, you know, as a response to crisis anxiety, in some ways they should be outsourcing study to what they feel is a neutral intelligence, to what they feel is something they can rely on. Obviously, at the moment, we can still point to the ways in which AI fails, with hallucinations and so on and so forth. Increasingly, that may not be the case, right? As the technology gets better, and students they have reason to ask, why should we, in a situation where so much is at stake, why should we risk ourselves rather than risking the algorithm? And I would suggest that, although, again, these are tendencies that may affect the university as a whole or elsewhere in the university, the humanities especially, I think, encourage anxiety, and perhaps literature and the study of literature above all. Here, after all, nothing seems certain to students. They feel they lack a key to interpretation. Sometimes I feel this is something that secondary schools have encouraged, but sometimes also university courses, to suggest that there is, if only they had the right techniques, right? They'd have the key, whether it's in terms of what is a symbol, what is a metaphor, and so on, that would give them access to the meaning hidden behind the words. But either way, there's the sense that there's too much to learn. The students are always behind, and as such, reading for many students is no longer, if it ever was, associated with pleasure. So I say this partly because in my courses the last few years, I often start asking, well, what do you think about the idea of literature? What sort of association do you have with the idea of literature? And almost universally, students would reply in terms of anxiety, in terms of a fear of uncertainty. And in some way, and they talk about the ways in which perhaps they might have grown up reading Harry Potter or whatever and associating reading with pleasure. But now, especially in the university context, that sense of an association between pleasure and reading had almost entirely disappeared. And especially grading feels haphazard and unpredictable. At a time when a grade seems to be more important than ever. So I'm going to talk about grading in a minute. our response to this sense of anxiety is often a slimmed down syllabus. After all, we feel that students are unprepared, especially in second languages, right? Especially when students come to study, say, Spanish language and literature, French language and literature, German language and literature. Insofar as they may not have much experience with the literary canon in their own language, they have much less experience in the literary canon in a second language. So we set texts as a result that are fewer, that are shorter, that are easier. We maybe shift from literature to what are felt to be more approachable genres. Not that there's anything wrong with studying, I don't know, film or comic books or whatever, but there does seem to be a problem if the reason for that is not because of what is of intrinsically interest or what is of interest in those genres, but because we ourselves fear or anxious about what would happen if we set long, dense, difficult novels, for instance. This is all in a attempt, which is again understandable, but I think counterproductive, to meet students where they are, as we sometimes say. But my feeling that by doing so, we sell both ourselves and also them short. So I'm going to propose that we ask more of our students rather than less. And I'm going to suggest a few things that I've been trying to do in the last, again, couple of years in my teaching, which seem to, or I hope, help enable that. And the first one is giving students control over their grade. And I'll explain that again a little. Challenge them to reading quantity, not quality. In part, this is inspired by, what's his name, Malcolm Gladwell, who really excel in a whole different set of areas from music to sport and so on. That it's he suggests 10,000 hours. You do anything for 10,000 hours, then you are going to be very good at it. And he talks about the Beatles in Hamburg, that played and played and played and played, and that's why when they returned to England, they became the Beatles. In some ways, I'm suggesting that just the more they read, even if they may be reading badly, at least to start off with, then ultimately that has a positive effect. I'm going to argue for returning to the canon, but preparing students for betrayal and surprise, right? The very things that normally cause them anxiety, but to suggest that those are features rather than bugs. So those are to rethink betrayal and surprise, and encourage them not to be themselves, not to stake themselves, but for them to be anyone but themselves, perhaps, insofar as we can present reading and learning as a form of play, a serious form of play, but a form of play with a whole different set of rules, which are no longer the rules of society as a whole. I mean, that's part of what a play or a game is. You invent rules which are made up, right? Which are arbitrary and unnecessary. For instance, I don't know, in football, that you can't touch the ball with a hand. There's no obviously natural reason why you shouldn't be able to, but you've imposed limits upon yourself by saying that in football the ball has to be touched only by other parts of the body, by the foot above all, right? And so by doing so, you are presenting something as self-consciously artificial, or as a role that you take up for a delimited amount of time. Hopefully have time to talk more about play shortly. Okay, let me talk. Let me talk very briefly then. Okay, I'm going to do just a little bit of skipping as I've just seen the time. So this is one of the courses that I've taught in the last few years. This is Romance Studies, and it's a survey of Romance language literature. In other words, literature written originally in Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Catalan, or Romanian, from modernism to the present. There we all are. But where I want to point to two things, one briefly and one at slightly more length. First of all, I offer them far too much than they could ever possibly read. In other words, there were like 20 books or so on the syllabus for a 12-week course, 20 full-length novels. But the point is they could choose between them. They could choose both each week between an option. They had at least they had two options in most weeks, and they could choose how many books they read over the course of the semester. So there was a sense of too much, there was a sense of excess, but there was also a sense that they had the power to negotiate that excess by choosing how much and which particular books that they were going to read. Almost all texts were optional. There were a few that were mandatory, but only for 4 weeks over the course of the semester. And they what they did was they wrote a contract. They wrote a contract saying how many books they were going to read and which books they were going to read, and it was based on that contract that they were apportioned a grade from the outset. So they chose at the beginning, and this is more or less what I told them. That depending on how many books they chosen to read, the end of the semester. So if they contracted to read a book every week, 12 books, essentially, then they get an A+. If they contracted to read 11 books, they'd get an A. If they contracted to read an A-, and so on and so forth, right? So this here you can see the basic. Actually, I've got those numbers slightly wrong, but here the numbers are right. And so it's 11 books, and they get an A+, 10 they get an A, and so on and so forth. And then the rest of the time, if they'd chosen, for 1 week that they weren't going to read a book, they didn't have to come to class. They didn't have to read the book. They didn't have to come to class. So they had to read 4 books in order to pass the class and come to class for 6 weeks. So the first week and the concluding week, and then 4 weeks in between. But beyond that, they were in control of their time. So again, in this sense of anxiety that they're not in control of their time, here they're given a set of choices. Do they have this semester? How demanding is their are there other classes? How demanding is their paid employment, for instance? And they were also told from the day one what their grade would be, so long as they fulfilled the contract. But again, the contract was more to do with the quantity than the quality of any reading. So they wrote individual contracts, signed and countersigned. They had a chance to amend the contract. The more effort they put in, essentially, the higher the grade. Highest grades meant reading a book a week. And when they failed their contracts, a whole series of other things came in. They didn't mean they necessarily failed the course at all. So I can talk a little bit more about that in the if people want to ask. Just briefly to say that on the one hand, students seem to like it. I enjoyed having complete control of my reading. And they often talked specifically about as this response was, I found this to help me reduce stress, which is the term that they were more likely to use rather than anxiety, as well as to be able to plan everything better and stay more organized, right? Or I never really felt overwhelmed or stressed by this class. Like this sense that they were empowered, and therefore because that basic framework of the course was set. That they were able to take certain risks. Okay, again, I'm going to. So that's the framework for these courses that I've been teaching. Let me talk briefly about. I'm going to first talk about the one in Romance Studies, and again, very briefly talk about the one in Latin American literature, because it seems to me what's important is not just how we teach, not just these sort of frameworks for teaching. But that also makes it different from what we teach, right? So that we can thematize difficulty, we can thematize anxiety. So, for instance, this sense of excess, of being overwhelmed, rather than just trying to wish it away, in fact, there was more excess and that there was more options. But I tried to make it a feature rather than a bug, so that the feeling of being overwhelmed might be caught up by a text. So, no, that's something that is a literary feature, and rather than wish it away, we can think more about it and provide a form of learning in excess and then in betrayal. This way is in which you find that you put a foot on a plank or something and it suddenly gives way, right? Which is their feeling that may happen at any time. So I suggest that by their nature, Romance languages and literatures, for instance, are excessive. And so I have an argument which, again, maybe I'll save more for the question and answer period or the discussion, but I link that to the what I suggest is the doubly post-colonial nature of Romance languages and literature, so which derive from Latin, which are therefore the remainder of the Roman Empire, right? They're the detritus, they're what's left behind of empire. And then, of course, so that's the sort of first post-colonial moment as the Roman Empire declined. Then Latin becomes a series of vernaculars in France and Spain and Italy and so on. But then they become the vehicle for a new round of colonialism, Europe's global imperial projects from 1492 to whenever, to 1900, let's say. But also they're the legacy of those projects and get turned against those projects. So they're both the vehicle of colonialism and its surplus. And the these languages and their representations betray colonial desires. So there's another form of betrayal here. So, I mean, this is part of the famous introduction to Antonio de Nebrija's grammar of the Castilian language, which is 1492, the same year as Columbus, the same year as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the Reconquista. Language is always the companion of empire and followed it, such that together they began, grew, and flourished. And later together they fell. I mean, that's where I think I'd take issue, right? The empires fall, but the languages remain as an excess or a surplus. So again, I could say a little bit more about this image. This is an image from the 1830s. The first moment or part of the first wave of decolonization, of course, immediately after the Haitian Revolution, after the American Revolution, and now after the Spanish American Wars of Independence. This is a picture of the Vandals sacking Rome. It's in many ways a picture of counter-empire. It's a picture of counterinsurgency, but expresses some of the anxieties about imperialism in the period. And I suggest that the Romance languages are Latin's bastard offspring, forged by plebeian foot soldiers and traders on the imperial outskirts. So in other words, that image of the sack of Rome is also, in some ways, an image of the triumph of Romance languages over the Roman. Romance studies emerges when tradition is infiltrated and overthrown by the demotic, by a nameless multitude. Okay, I'm gonna skip a little. So I said something about Romance studies. I say a little bit about the argument that I make about Latin American literature specifically, as I was suggesting before, a play, a form of play, but now with the canon. And I'm suggesting a sort of counterintuitive, paradoxical suggestion that rather than Victorian period where children were presented as miniature adults who were play acting as us, given mini versions of adult clothing, for instance. That's a form of cosseting our students, and perhaps less helicopter professoring. This is back to some of the arguments from Haidt, perhaps, but more wild play in the classroom, returning to the canon and to difficulty by making a game of it. So I'm inspired in part. Well, this is one of the many literary sort of inspirations. Once you start reading the canon in terms of play, you realize that play is everywhere. This is from what is obviously one of the most canonical books in the Latin American canon, at least, perhaps the most canonical one, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, a book which is very seldom taught, incidentally, because it's too long, too difficult. We tend to teach, No One Writes to the Colonel, for instance, or Leaf Storm, some of these early shorter texts. But this is from 100 Years of Solitude. It's towards the end of 100 Years of Solitude, and it's about a sort of later generation. If you haven't read the book is about essentially about a family and its various iterations and various generations and degenerations. And here we have two of the children, Amaranta Ursula, little Aureliano, who remember the rains as a happy time, which is a time of otherwise devastation. There's increasingly devastation in the small town of Macondo. In spite of Fernanda's strictness, they'd splash in the puddles in the courtyard, catch lizards and dissect them and pretend they were poisoning the soup with dust from butterfly wings. Ursula Iguaran was their most amusing plaything. Now, this is the matriarch. This is the matriarch of the Buendia family. And in her dotage, she's all blind, back and forth from one corner to another, wrapped in coloured cloth, and with her face painted with soot and anato, and once they're on the point of plucking out her eyes with the pruning shears, as they'd done with the frogs. That's what we do with something that is moribund, that is almost a corpse, that hardly has signs of life. Maybe the thing is to turn it into a plaything. After all, in Garcia Marquez's novel, Ursula the matriarch epitomizes anxiety. She has this fear of deformed offspring, this fear that a child will be born with the tail of a pig, which, spoiler alert, ultimately happens. But here the young take the past in hand through play. And so I'm asking, can we imagine the canon itself, the canon of Latin American literature, as such a plaything? At present, we either accord it too much respect or ignore it entirely from our anxieties. But if we play with it and play, we indulge in make-believe. We act out new roles. They're only temporary. We know that a game lasts a certain amount of time. It lasts for whatever, 90 minutes, 5 days if there's a test match. But even a cricket test match has its endpoint, and in which we take on different roles. Batter or bowler and so on, that we don't necessarily confuse with who we actually are, with our essence. We follow rules we know we're made up. Again, in football, you have to kick the ball with the foot rather than with the hand. And we may make up new wrong ones. There might be forms of children's play which are inventive, which you make up new rules and new restrictions on the spot. But as we do so, we reinvent hierarchies. Experiment wouldn't take very seriously, and we make them serious. Whereas we take things that ordinarily we take seriously, and we make them seem to be unimportant. The play, this is the notion of I've forgotten his name, play theorist now. The sphere of play as a charm circle that has its own logic, which is different from that of society at large. Or think of carnival, of course, right, as that form of play in which hierarchies can get inverted and rethought, if only for a day, if only briefly, but they make us think differently about them. So I suggest, and I'm going to just finish then, well, almost finish, with a couple of things that I suggest, that's part of, I suggest to students, and I suggest to us as well, that is the mistakes and the missteps that can be most interesting in any reading of literature. After all, as Borges suggests in Pierre Menard, even the most faithful recreation and repetition of a text will always introduce difference. I mean, such mistakes are inevitable, and therefore perhaps not to be a source of anxiety in the same way that they often are. So let me, again, skip it a little, and just in lieu of a conclusion, offer some brief, almost manifesto-like thoughts. Even though none of this may solve the crisis of the humanities, it may be too late. The university is in ruins. I like very much that book by Bill Redding from, actually it's quite old now, it's 30 years or so old, The University in Ruins. It seems to me the university is in ruins even more so than when Redding wrote that book, but that we can also learn in and from the ruins. Ruins teach us about the past and the fate of power, the fact that power also inevitably, in the end, crumbles and fades. The Roman Empire, too, declines and falls. But ruins are also places for play. If you go to ruins, I don't know, anywhere, you find people playing in and around them, or when after the Second World War, in European cities which have been bombed out, those bomb sites become places where kids would often indulge in a sort of wild play, where they'd also remake the past, not waiting for things to be rebuilt, so impatient for the future. If the universe is already broken, we can hardly be anxious about breaking it now, and perhaps we need not fear its decline. We can run with the critique. Many of the critiques of the institution were well considered and important. In the institution may, in some cases, hardly have deserved to survive. But to critique something, and as I say, the heart of the universe is not necessarily to reject the object of the critique, but rather refuse to make it let us feel worse. So, let it make us feel anxious. That's all. Okay, so I've realized I'm very happy to talk about further in the questions and discussion about any of these points and to hear from you, your experience and your thoughts on them. But again, to reconstruct the idea of the humanities, the university, and perhaps especially the literature classroom as a place not to be yourself, but to try out a role in a game within a framework in which hopefully at least some of the rational causes of anxiety have been somewhat dissolved. So again, I apologize for going on a little long, and thank you very much for giving me this chance to share some thoughts with you. Now, I at least cannot hear if anything is being said. I don't know if there's anything being said that I should be able to hear.
The room is mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, are we good?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, great, excellent, right. All right, I'm Des now, and I'm going to moderate the question and answer section. So if anybody has questions, you could use the raise hand feature in Zoom. You can type in the chat, or anybody in the room can kind of raise their hand. I don't see any questions just yet, but I can kind of kick us off. I have a lot of thoughts and questions and so on about different things. So, I mean, I think on the one hand, you're kind of talking about anxiety and so on, and I think that's, I mean, everywhere now, all sorts of reasons that you kind of identified. I mean, I was kind of curious because I suspect that a lot of the statistics and so on that you shared was kind of coming from the US or North American kind of context. And I'm kind of curious about, I think there's anxiety everywhere. It's a kind of global thing that we're kind of seeing. But what's the nuance between kind of potentially global North and global South? And maybe my colleagues here can kind of share more about that. Is there kind of nuance way in which you're seeing anxiety being expressed or experienced across global North, global South? And I suppose one of the kind of quick question is this, I think I'm a huge fan of this issue of play and engaging more play in the classrooms. I was just talking with Julian about, experimenting with board games and gamification and all these sorts of things. But I wanted to kind of press you a little further to tell us a bit about how, the system is broken. So it's okay about kind of breaking it more, right? But how do we integrate play, when we have, I don't know, in our context, for example, you might have traditional exams. It might be even more anxiety producing to see, students might feel as though introducing play in this way in the classroom might not be preparing them and so on. So I think there's a lot to kind of think about, but I completely agree with how we can kind of find ways to make the classroom a lot more fun. But I think we have a lot of thinking about how does it integrate, with systems of assessment, etc. and so on. So 2 quick thoughts, comments, questions, while we wait for more questions in the room or on Zoom. But maybe you have any reaction to what I've said so far.
No, thank you very much for those questions. The first, I was certainly very conscious about the question about the sort of geographical and social distribution of anxiety, both so global north and global south, but we might also think about, I don't know, the gendering of anxiety, the class dynamics of anxiety, and so on and so forth. Most of the things that I've read, most of the statistics that are available are focused on North America, although to some extent, as I said, I mean, Haidt, for instance, does gesture at least to other parts of the world. As part of his argument is that these are. Well, this is a disorder of technology. So he wants to in order to make that argument, he has to do at least some comparative work, but it's mainly drawing on North America. I'd be interested in hearing what you think and say from your experience. Experience. I was really struck that again in Peru recently. By the ways in which, perhaps even more so, or maybe that's anecdotal amongst the people that I was talking to, parents of kids and so on. In some ways, that it felt that there was almost more anxiety around education. I mean, Peru is, although to be fair, Peru is also a bit of an outlier in the 20th century, at least. It was suggested that Peru was the Latin American country that had most faith in the possibility of education as social mobility. Then that was a hope kind of dashed, and that's part of the reason that people argue for the rise even of Sendero Luminoso and their insurgency in the 1980s. That's certainly Carlos Ivan de Gregori's argument, that rather than becoming anxiety, the frustration with education and the failures of the education sector became rage, became anger. But now I think it's anxiety. But that's anecdotal, right? That's my experience in somewhere like Peru. And I'd love to hear from your experience and your anecdotes and your sense of how things are elsewhere. In terms of the play and the kind of strictures and restrictions, I'd say one thing. I'm not entirely sure if I agree, or I'm suggesting that play is the same thing as fun. By the way, play can be fun, of course, right? And that there's often an association between play and fun. But I'm sort of more interested in. But I think there are a range of affects and emotions that play can evoke or invoke, right? It can be also, I don't know, exhausting. It can also be, I don't know, it has its own. But what's different about play is that it is recognizably by a set of more or less arbitrary rules. I'd say that's what's different. Now, if adjustments have to be made to the requirements and strictures imposed, say in this case by the university, grading, for instance, then one would be interested in ways in which to establish a framework within which play becomes possible. So again, I mean, that always is the case, right? The play requires a framework. Right, it requires that differentiation. So rather than the university's been trying to justify itself by suggesting there's almost no barrier, or there's the thinnest of barriers between university logic and social logic. I'm suggesting no. We should reinstitute a sense that things happen differently here. At least briefly, at least temporarily. And that is what enables a sense of play. Now, it is also true, and I think this is what you're suggesting, that perhaps, perhaps some populations, right, some sectors of the population feel happier with the notion of play, or feel enabled more easily than others. So it's a question of, well, how do you establish the regulations? How do you establish the framework that, to use that metaphor, levels the playing field, right? That enables more people to feel the right to and the freedom to play. And so that's why I was talking about contract grading, for instance. But I think there are other ways in which we can think through enabling university and study and literature as play rather than a series of tests that can never be passed. Sorry, I probably went on too long in my answer to that question. Those questions, they were good questions. Thank you. I can't. I think you're talking. I can't hear at the moment.
Sorry. Oh, hello?
I can now.
Right, I think there's certainly more research we need to do to get more geographical coverage, as you mentioned, like gendering and class and so on. And I think, the key point I think is coming across is play, if not so much as fun, but as informal, as perhaps more relaxing, as, perhaps less rigid than we see systems and things. So, I agree, there needs to be a kind of framework for play. But we have one question, well, we have a few questions. Please, Dr. Edwards.
He can hear. If you speak loud, he can hear.
Just so you can see.
Yeah.
Is play also privilege? Is there a way in which literature has set up play as privilege for some, but not for some? And so the idea that we can use play in the classroom already sets people apart from each other. And it's likely part of the reason why play is not so much fun for some people, but it's fun for other people. Yeah.
No, again, I think that's a great question. Although, again, I want to get away from the idea of fun. I really do. And also relaxing. I don't. But the notion of fun or diversion, though it is true that some forms of some forms of play are pleasurable, but not always. But yes, let me think. So I think part of the criticism of the university, which is valid, as I was suggesting, is that at some point in the past, it was precisely the privilege of a very small fraction of society who were able to take time off, as it were, right? And university was a point, a form of decadence. Again, Brideshead Revisited is perhaps, at least in the British context, the classic view of that. But then, not just, right? The way in which it was for 4 years, you're 3 years or 4 years, you went away and sort of experimented with yourself, to some extent, and then after a while you would return and you'd become whatever, a banker or a lawyer or something like that. That criticism is well taken, and obviously that elitist university, it is good that we have more or less seen the back of it. I say more or less, of course, because the university remains very stratified, and there's no doubt people still at places like Harvard that are able to treat university in that way. But the question we've got to be asking then is there a way in which to reconstruct the university and the classroom in such a manner that more people feel enabled and empowered to establish a distance between those constrictions of otherwise life, which are endlessly impinging. And I suggest the one way to do this, and it may be a relatively small way, but it's an immediate way, is to mess with the grade, to play with the grade, in other words, right? So that, at present, the grade is part of that, sense that students are endlessly being judged, and they need high marks in order to get good jobs. In other words, it's all part of the way in which the university pre-qualifies students for the job market. But when you use it in other ways, and essentially what I'm using it for here in these courses is also to bribe students to read more. In part, right? The more they read, the higher the grade they get. Is to rethink those things that we do have some kind of control over, again, in order perhaps to widen access to a sense of play. But I should also say, again, it depends what kind of play we're thinking about, right? But again, in the world at large, let's say, I mean, play is not solely restricted to elites, right? There are, I mean, there's a whole sociology of sport, right? In which, I don't know, rugby league in the north of England or whatever, basketball for African Americans or whatever, right? Are vehicles, right? Are vehicles not just for fun, again, not for fun or relaxation, but also vehicles for, I don't know, for them to take on new roles, right? And again, that's what's fundamental to me for play. It is a chance to take on a new identity briefly, right? Whether it is again a role in for six balls, the bowler, right? The wicketkeeper or whatever, thinking of cricket. That's always been the case for, again, working class and racialized communities. Also, play is not simply some forms of play, polo, golf, whatever, right? Are the preserve of the elite. But to suggest that play is only ever an elite activity, I think is clearly a mistake. So the question is to see if university classrooms, study and learning can also be transformed into those forms of, again, serious, not fun, relaxing moments of reinvention and establishing a distance from those kinds of social pressures and determinants.
Oh, great, thank you. I'll take Prof. Ramsey next online. We have two more questions in there.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Beasley, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. I thank you for underlining what some of us know very well about the decline in literary studies and how, for a number of reasons, including the fact that many parents tear them away from the humanities and from disciplines like literature, students are choosing to do literature in fewer numbers. I want to focus a little more closely on the idea of literature as play, as you suggested by your title. First of all, I want to begin by saying that I had the good fortune of having lecturers who obviously enjoyed literature throughout as an undergraduate, and even as someone in graduate studies, in literary studies. I recall all of those people who were full of passion for imparting literature. And I think that went a long way in motivating me and perhaps motivating others. And I don't know, perhaps that's the first part of play that, we need to continue despite the bleaky sort of outlook, continue with the passion and allow students, not be afraid of allowing students to see our passion and sort of pull them in with our passion. I think that's the starting part of play. of literature as play. That brings me to something you mentioned about hopscotch. When you mentioned that article on translation. And I wondered to myself to what extent you were being influenced by hopscotch, Rayuela, Julio Cortázar's book, because I remember a long time ago when I taught it, not here, elsewhere, that what helped my students to understand that, yes, this is such a difficult book. But if you think that the process, the way you are going to derive meaning from this book and get into this book is to think about the game of hopscotch. And once they got that in their heads, that, oh, I literally have to play hopscotch with my reading because Julio Cortázar has chopped up this book and put it all over the place so much that it made a very big difference. So I think that even though all books will not be, as crazy in their structures as hopscotch, as Rayuela, that we could also take the concept of this game to them and say that in order to get to all the different meanings in a literary text, that you have to play hopscotch. This is play. Just imagine yourself playing hopscotch, where you have to jump here, jump there, get into all the different boxes to put meaning together. That is literature as play for me, one aspect. You can tell me how you think. Then the other thought that came to my mind was when you read the excerpt from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And, it's very ironic for me because what I love about Gabriel Garcia Marquez is that he is the master of humor. So even in that little excerpt, which is really challenging, and for you, it causes anxiety. Perhaps there is much, even when you read El Coronel, you read The Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and so on. There is a lot that may or may not evoke anxiety, but I think that Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself provides so much medicine, so much to use as recovery from this anxiety. I was hoping that you would have talked a little more. I don't know, if you want to comment on that, about the humor that is so integral to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that no matter what he's talking about, he finds a way through his metaphors and exaggeration. He finds a way of making it funny. He could be talking about the craziest, ugliest, most surreal thing, and he's finding a way of making it. And to me, that's play in literature. And if we can pull our students into the humor, so I don't know if I am seeing play as comprising too many discrete aspects, whereas you probably are looking at it in perhaps a more broad-brushed philosophical way. But those were just some of I think that Marquez's humor supersedes any problem, any difficulty he's writing about. And he brings play into reading. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed. I agree with you, though it's tough. Humor is tough in the classroom. You tell students things like that's that last thing that they get easily. They're not prepared for humor. They don't see Garcia Marquez as funny or other things. When I teach Borges, I mean, they get very. Borges is like a machine producing anxiety, and I said, "Do you not realize this is a joke, right?" So So humor's hard. Humor's hard to convey. That's certainly one element of some forms of play. Again, I'd underline there are lots of forms of play. I don't think that play is necessarily funny, is necessarily humorous, but there's forms of play that are, and humor is often, play with words, play with language, play with objects, as in the case of the brief excerpt that I was given. On hopscotch, oh, absolutely. I mean, hopscotch is in some ways the inspiration for this. I mean, the book Rayuela by Cortázar, for those people who don't know the book, I mean, one of the things, it has a series of numbered chapters, and you can either begin at chapter 1, or there's a sort of guide says, well, you can begin at 73 and go this other way, or presumably there are other places where you can enter and exit, right? So hopscotch is this, this model, I suppose, of a postmodern work with multiple entrances and exits, and this is something that Cortázar is interested in a lot of his work. But I also like Hopscotch the game. Hopscotch the game, of course, is one of the most simple games, one of the oldest games, played around the world with different names. So Rayuela in parts of Latin America, but a whole other different set of names elsewhere, which involves sort of adapting the street, for instance. You all you need is a piece of chalk and a stone. It is, if we go back to the notion of elite versus, I don't know, plebeian, as it were, right? It is one of the least elite of sports, right? But it involves changing and reworking of usually the urban environment, right? A patch of concrete, a set of stones, or something like that. So that way in which, through play, you can reconstruct the landscape within which you find yourself, your immediate environment, again, at least briefly, by putting it to other uses, is something that interests me too. So there's as it were, a play between that literary antecedent, which is Cortázar, very much the canon, very much one of the difficult books, a game that almost anyone, anywhere in the world that you might have spoken to will be more or less familiar with and will have played it at one point or the other. So that sort of democratizing and democratic notion, as well as a returning to the canon, is part of what I find sort of inspiring about, or interesting about that play in Hopscotch itself. And your first point was about, I don't know, teaching and passion. I agree with that. Again, not necessarily enjoyment. I'm not entirely sure that teaching or studying or playing is always the same thing as enjoyment. It can be bruising. You can fall. You expect to fall, perhaps, right? You can find yourself, your arm scratched up if you fall in a game of hopscotch, for instance, or if you've had a vicious tackle in football or rugby or something like that. But the point is that with play, play always also involves replay. You try again. You might not have won this Saturday, but you might win next Saturday, right? There's something about the iterability of play that also seems important. In other words, that a setback now is not a permanent setback. I think that's another part of the world of play that is different from that sense that students have, that it's now or never, that if they mess up now, then in some ways they've stained their future indelibly. So that's something else I think that we can learn from it. So, but thank you for those questions, and absolutely, yes, I think is my short answer to all of them.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So in the interest of, we have a few questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask that those with the questions, I'm going to call the names, ask a question briefly, and we'll leave the final word with our speaker to respond to everyone. So we have Dr. Hollett Gentles, Professor Corenberg, and Dr. Montoya Stemmen.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Beasley Murray, for your really interesting presentation. Sorry. Okay, I have a very mundane question. So in your course with your contract grading, do you actually teach? And what do you do? Do you just have a discussion each week, guided discussion with the students about what they're reading? I'd really like to know that practical part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and so my question connects to that. So first of all, thank you for what turned out to be a masterclass in how to combat anxiety. I love it. But I really want to know what happens when students break their contracts.
And our final question, Elizabeth.
Okay.
Okay.
So, you said that in order to counteract anxiety, you transform reading as a play. But, as a Colombian, knowing Garcia Marquez very well, I take an issue with the example you gave. So the example you gave about 100 Years of Solitude may seem fun because the world it describes is full of natural wonders. But understanding that there is a political pressure that must be understood there. So trivializing personal narratives that encompass the history of oppression would be like, you think that is fun? I'm glad you said about the enjoyment and bruises, but so they have to understand the importance of literature and the author writings, and to understand the great duty of literature. Because Garcia Marquez's humor can be fun, but is embedded with another narrative of oppression, of American dominance. And that's one of the reasons that Garcia Marquez had to go to Mexico, because he was in exile. So how you combine this fun, this play, I don't understand, with these topics that are not fun. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
Should I respond? I see one other person, Rudolph Ellis, has his hand up.
Yes, John, that was a very interesting, well-knitted presentation looking at issues from the angle of literature. But my question is this: how does the idea of play informs identity creation philosophically and in literature? How does the idea of play informs identity creation philosophically and in literature? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all those for those questions. So just brief. Okay, I'll go backwards. I'll go from the last to the first. So I could talk at greater length in terms of I don't know, philosophy or theory or whatever. But as I was trying to suggest, the relationship between play and identity is, I think, about a sense of performativity or malleability of identity. Again, within restrictions, right? It's not free play. Free play is a different thing, right? Though that's something we could talk about too. But there's very seldom any such thing as completely free play, right? Almost all games and sports have rules and constrictions. In fact, they may have many more rules and constrictions than we are normally aware of in daily life, right? But they enable, partly because of those rules and restrictions, they enable a partial, temporary reconstruction of identity, a play with identity, so that play. I mean, just in brief, I guess in a sentence, right? Play relativizes identity. I think. Doesn't abolish it, doesn't do away with it altogether, but it relativizes it. Then the question from I forget who the previous question. I just want to repeat. I'm not talking about fun. Fun sometimes, maybe, right? I'm not against fun. But I think there's a problem where we are play with fun, right? And play also somehow frivolous, or I mean, that's the same kind of argument, of course, is made about literature. That literature is decorative, or so literature is not the real; it's merely a representation. The real literature is, I don't know, frivolous. And as you were saying, that's not at all necessarily the case. And the relationship between writing and politics in Latin America, in Colombia, but not just in Colombia. I mean, there's a long history of that, right? Since I don't know, 1532 at least, right? The meeting between Atahualpa and Pizarro. That writing has always had directly political implications and consequences. And I'm thinking about the incident in Cajamarca, where Fray Velade I'm thinking about this because I was in Cajamarca last week, right? Presents the missile to Atahualpa and he throws it to the ground, and that's taken as the justification for conquest. Just as the relationship between writing and literature and politics is very, not necessarily direct, but is very, imbricated, the one with the other, in Latin America, but not just in Latin America, but perhaps particularly obviously in Latin America. The same, I'd say, with play. I think we can and should think about, the political games that are played. I mean, I think of, I don't know, who is it? Rudyard Kipling talking about, the imperial powers in South Asia in terms of the great game, right, of espionage, the British against the Russians, and for instance. Well, I think about Pierre Bourdieu, right? I mean, Pierre Bourdieu's notion of social conflict is all in terms of the game and the use and the misuse of cultural and social capital, as well as economic capital within particular fields, as he calls them. But we can think about it in terms of sports fields. So to talk about games, to talk about play, to talk about the particular strategies and rules that are constructed for such games, is also to talk absolutely and immediately about politics. To try and suggest that games are only about fun, that play is only ever about diversion, is to misunderstand, it seems to me, right? To misunderstand both play and politics. So, and we could think about the relationship between sport and politics in similar ways, but also, again, the ways in which, ordinary people invest themselves in the kinds of, in the passions, to go back to the question about passion, of whether it's football or basketball, or whether it's chess, or whether it's, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons, in different ways, right? In ways in which, at least briefly, everything seems to be at stake. And I think that those kinds of games, those kind of political and social and personal games, are absolutely also what Garcia Marquez is talking about in Cien Años de Soledad, right? There's much more to say about that. But again, I want to speak about fun. The integration between play and undo. Okay, so then there's two questions about this, about the teaching. So breaking contracts. So if you break your contract, you cannot get the grade for which you contracted. You can only get a lower grade than the one that you contracted. And one of the things that happens, you have to take the exam. You have to take an exam. Otherwise, there are no exams in the course, but you have to take an exam at the end of the course. And a whole sort of different set of a much more sort of traditional approach to grading suddenly kicks in if you break the contract. And you can break the contract in more than so using AI is certainly why I talk a lot about trust and contracts and the way in which contracts work, and they're using AI, for instance, is breaking the contract. The question, do I teach? I guess I like to think I do. It depends what you mean by teaching, of course, right? But so, for instance, I record lectures. I lecture to them. I do record them. I put them on YouTube. If you look at the links for each course, you can see the lectures that I've recorded. We have, because partly there's a variable number of students in the class. It varies from week to week. Sometimes it's larger, sometimes it's smaller. It's mainly seminar. It's mainly a seminar base of teaching. But yes, I think I teach. I think I do all the things that you would probably recognize as teaching. I don't think that's again, it's not like it doesn't become some kind of free play therapy session, just because play becomes the metaphor, right, or the mode. That doesn't mean it's no longer serious. And again, it's not always fun, but that's okay.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, wrap up the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for the answers to all the questions.
Thank you all for your for listening, and for your questions, and for the invitation. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Have a great
One
evening.
moment, and we are going to close. One moment.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we want to thank you, Dr. Beasley Murray, for this fantastic and provocative presentation. It has certainly sparked some thoughts and ideas in my own head around play, and not just as oppositional, but the fact that play itself can be riddled with anxiety. So we want to thank you very much. He's looking up. We want to thank you very much, and we want to thank our participants who were here this evening online, who faithfully came and stayed and listened. Thank you, Professor Cohenberg, for your rundown of where we've been over these past lectures, and thank you for you as well, Dr. Drexel, for hosting the question and answer session. And we hope at some point we can meet again to do some further work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.